Many UFO abductees who claim they have been inside an alien craft describe their experience in a dreamlike state, whilst under some sort of hypnotic trance. The following story is about an alien encounter that occurred in 1950 in Argentina, South America, where the observer was not abducted by aliens but simply walked into an alien craft that had landed in a field where he found the hatch open. Dr. Enrique Catalina Bossa was a 40-year-old ex-war pilot and aeronautical engineer who was employed as an engineer working with a well-known company in Caracas, Venezuela. On May the 10th, 1950, while working for his company down in Argentina on a large construction project, Dr. Bossa was driving down the highway about 75 miles from his hotel in an isolated area known as Bahia Blanca, when he saw a metallic disc-shaped object sitting on the grass just off the roadway. He stopped the car and observed the object for a few minutes. There was no sign of any movement, so he decided to approach the strange object. Although the coating of the saucer appeared metallic in appearance, it had a rubbery feel to it. As he drew closer, he could see there was a doorway on the side of the craft and bravely entered. As he entered, all appeared quiet and empty, except for a blinking red light at the top of the dome, and there were holes in the floor of the craft. The control panel had a transparent sphere above it, which rotated. He then decided to go further into the object, where he then entered a larger room and saw 4 curved seats, where 3 of them were occupied by small beings with large heads, about 4 feet tall, wearing grey skin-tight outfits. The aliens were all facing a control panel that consisted of lights, gauges and various meters. Bossa stood quietly behind them and then slowly plucked up the courage to touch one of them. It felt rigid with a charred texture. The rigidness of the alien skin was an indication to him that they were all dead. He quickly exited the craft and ran to his car and sped back to his hotel. He recounted his experience to 2 colleagues. By this time, it was almost dark, so they decided to wait until daylight the following morning. Next day, Bossa and his 3 companions went directly to the location where he had had his strange encounter, but there was no craft, just a pile of ashes. One of the men touched some of the ashes, causing his hand to turn purple. His hand remained that colour for several days. Disappointed that the craft had gone, they looked around for any further evidence that a saucer had landed in that area. Then one of the men looked up and saw 3 objects in the sky. One of the objects was very large and cigar-shaped. The other 2 were much smaller and disc-shaped. Bossa grabbed his camera and snapped 5 pictures. Unfortunately, they came out rather blurred. The 2 smaller objects then joined the cigar-shaped object, which then became one and then turned reddish and quickly vanished from view. Immediately after the encounter, Dr. Bossa came down with a fever, and his skin blistered, which lasted for several weeks. Bossa also found that an impression of his sunglasses that he'd worn on the craft had been left on his face, but tests showed that there were no signs of any radiation burns. Doctors were baffled by his skin condition and were unable to discover the cause of his ailment. Other than his companions, Bossa would keep any details of his strange encounter private, believing authorities would not believe Bossa's amazing story. What gives the story credibility is that Bossa was a highly qualified professional and was therefore a credible witness. In 1955, Dr. Bossa told his story to technical translator Horacio Gonzalez in Caracas, Venezuela, at a UFO conference. He later met up with famous UFO researcher Leon Stringfield, who later released details about Dr. Bossa's encounter in a book titled Situation Red. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit like. It really helps to keep the channel growing. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. We've got lots of strange and fascinating stories coming up, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. With 70% of the Earth's surface made up of oceans and lakes, wouldn't it be an obvious place for aliens to set up bases, and we would never be aware of them? With their apparent advanced technology, they could build numerous amazing underwater structures all over the globe. The following cases expose this possibility. Number 5. Catalina Island, Los Angeles. On April 15, 1966, an object with no tail and no visible means of propulsion was seen flying at speeds from 130 to 170 miles per hour and made no sound at all. It was filmed by a man called Lehman Hansen, who at the time was working for the United States Navy. Since then, these objects have been witnessed on numerous occasions flying in and out of the water, and the name given to these objects was USOs, Unidentified Submerged Objects. On January 26, 1980, a pilot called Noah Felice and his cousin were flying their Piper Cherokee around the Catalina Channel when they spotted an object in the water with someone or something standing on it. Then the object shot out a beam of light that first paralyzed the instruments, and then a second beam forced it to crash into the sea. Unfortunately, his cousin was killed, whilst Noah, who at this stage claimed he must have been dead underwater for at least 15 minutes, found he had somehow escaped with relatively minor injuries, and believes whoever was in the USO had rescued him and brought him back to life. Number 4. Shag Harbour, Nova Scotia. On the night of October 4th, at about 11:20 p.m. 1967, several people reported seeing a 60-foot-long lit object that later descended into the water, causing some people to panic, believing it was an aircraft crashing into the sea. It was described as having had several orange glowing lights and eventually sunk, leaving behind a trail of yellow foam half a mile long. Fishing boats and the Coast Guard went out looking for survivors. However, nothing was ever found. The military sent out divers who followed up with an extensive search. When more information came to light, it was found that the object was first spotted on radar coming out of Siberia. After crashing into the harbour, it then travelled underwater up the coast to Shelbourne, where it came to rest on the submarine magnetic detection grid and was supposedly joined by a second vehicle. Military ships were anchored there for a week in an attempt to recover the object. One diver said that after witnessing the object, claimed it was not of planet Earth. Other military witnesses also claimed there were two objects, with one trying to assist the other. On October the 11th, the military suddenly called off the search, where later that evening an object was seen departing the area. A book was written about the incident called Dark Object by Don Ledger and Dick Stiles. Number 3. Malta, 1971. In November 1971, Maltese fisherman Paolo Zamet and his crew were about 20 miles out to sea south of Malta when they spotted a large dark object floating on the water about 900 feet away and believed it to be a black submarine. A very bright light then flashed out from the object, causing them to shield their eyes, but when they looked back, they saw a number of small humanoid men, each about the height of a 10-year-old child, walking about on top of the object. Some of the men were wearing what appeared to be belts attached to tools or some other equipment. Then after a few minutes, the figures jumped through an opening in the object's hull and disappeared. There was then a bright flash, causing the fishermen to look away, and when they looked back, the object had suddenly vanished. Number 2. Lake Baikal, Siberia. On the 17th of April 1987, Valery Rutenstov describes that at about 12:20 a.m., a flying saucer appeared approximately 150 meters above him, and from the center of the object was a phosphorescent purple ray. At the edges of the object were yellow portals, and the diameter of the object was about 70 meters, and it was silent. Then the object slid smoothly away and sailed along the shore of the bay. On the 9th of July 2009, at about 10 p.m, Sergei Konechnik and his son were on their balcony when suddenly there appeared two glowing balls with a yellow core and an orange-red surround hovering over the water. In July 2010, Nikita Toman describes an object with a shining green light flying above the lakeside and then above him. Vyacheslav Lalevich was on a yacht on the lake when a huge shining disc about 500 to 700 meters in diameter appeared below the surface and glowed for about 3 minutes, lighting up the yacht before shooting into the sky. Oleg Chicholin was also on a boat training students when they saw a glowing ball floating on the water that started to slowly fade, then turn into a red ball. For a while the red ball lay on the water, but then gradually sunk under the water. In 1982, 7 military divers reported to have come across aliens under Lake Baikal. Alexei Tivinyenko said at a depth of 50 meters, they met swimmers around 3 meters tall, dressed in tight-fitting silvery suits. They did not have any scuba or other devices, just helmets on their heads. Number 1. Puerto Rico, 1963. One of the most famous incidences happened in March 1963 involving USS Wasp aircraft carrier off Puerto Rico. Sonar picked up an object moving at 150 knots, 20,000 feet below. The object would propel to impossible speeds, then stop for a while as the Navy would catch up. For 4 days, the fleet tracked the unknown object, recording its speed. There is nothing in any naval inventory anywhere in the world that can approach anything remotely that speed, then or now. The object descended to a depth of 27,000 feet. The pressures down there are so vast that they would crush any vessel that went down that deep. 13 captains will enter the incident in their ship's logs. A great deal of the strange activity around the island has centered on the area known as El Yunque. Jose Orlando Goles, who works for the Puerto Rican government, lives close to El Yunque. He says many people have seen UFOs flying over the water close to the surface, he said. One evening at around 1 a.m, we saw an object with many coloured lights flying next to the sea just over the surface. It seemed to be dark underneath and had lights, mostly red and blue. Then it angled and moved upwards. It made a humming sound and seemed to head in the direction of El Yunque. The number of UFO sightings over the waters of the Triangle, as well as USOs below, has been a constant since the time of Columbus. The early sailors and explorers called the underwater disturbances wheels of light. UFOs have been seen from ships, from shore, and from experienced pilots with a specific concentration near and on Puerto Rico. There has been a tremendous surge of UFO sightings in Puerto Rico since the early 1990s, and for many of the Puerto Rican witnesses, they're absolutely convinced that there's some sort of massive futuristic installation deep below Puerto Rico, under the ocean bed. There have been hundreds of cases of UFO encounters where people have been cured of illnesses and diseases ranging from the basic common cold, cancer, and recovering from injuries. Some of these cases were verified by UFO investigators, doctors, and other officials who found it difficult to accept the fact that some of these people had been cured of a disease or recovered from an accident that science had no known cure or treatment for. The following are 3 incredible stories of people who encountered aliens and were either healed or miraculously recovered from injuries. Number 3. Chris Bledsoe. Chris Bledsoe was a commercial pilot who also had his own business, but found life difficult due to ill health. He suffered from an incurable condition called Crohn's disease, which he'd had for 15 years, and found life extremely painful. On the evening of January the 8th, 2007, Chris went fishing with his 7-year-old son, Chris Jr., and 5 workmates, and on that particular evening was not feeling too good and decided to go off hunting by himself, whilst his son and the other men stayed at the lake fishing. As the sun was setting, he came upon an open field and suddenly encountered 2 round objects the size of a bus, sitting about 100 feet above the trees. He described the colour of the objects as orange liquid fire, and being a pilot, he said they were certainly not of this world. His emotions were of deep, deep fear, and up until that moment, he had never ever thought of UFOs, and they had never ever entered his vocabulary. At this stage, He had become so frightened that he'd squatted down to avoid detection. Chris looked around for any means of escape, but as he looked back up, the sky appeared to open up like a zip, and then a third object had joined the other two, and at that very moment he knew that he'd been seen by them. He was now so fearful that he suddenly found himself running, and eventually made his way back to the other men and proceeded to tell them what he'd just experienced. His friends claimed that they'd been looking for him for hours, but to Chris, he felt he'd only been gone for about 20 minutes. He later found that he'd been missing for 4 hours. Chris asked where his son Chris Jr. was, and his friends said that he'd gone out looking for him. Chris then went in search of him and eventually found him in a panicked state, where he too had experienced unusual happenings. His son claims to have come upon 2 small beings who appeared to be red and glowing, wearing what looked like swimming goggles, and were about 3 feet tall. His son claims that as he was observing the aliens picking up cans and bottles, they suddenly spotted him. Then one of the aliens just stared at him, whereupon Chris Jr. suddenly became paralysed. He could not even scream. He claims his paralysis had stopped when the aliens must have seen the headlights of his father's truck. Chris and his son then made their way back to the other men, where everyone appeared wide-eyed and shocked. Suddenly one of the men looked up and shouted that the sky was now full of at least 9 round objects, all slowly manoeuvring around each other, and then 3 of the objects landed on the other side of the river. Pandemonium had now set in as they all raced towards the truck. Chris was driving as fast as he could, with the other men screaming, "Go, go, go!" Suddenly, one of the men looked up and shouted that the sky was now full of at least 9 round objects, all slowly manoeuvring around each other, and then 3 of the objects landed on the other side of the river. Pandemonium had now set in as they all raced towards the truck. Chris was driving as fast as he could, with the other men screaming, "Go, go, go!" One of the men looked at the back and saw the terrifying sight of one of the small beings chasing them on all 4s. The truck then came upon the field where Chris had originally encountered the objects and suddenly slammed on the brakes. They were now observing 2 fiery objects sitting above the trees. They were so terrified they all thought the world was coming to an end. One of the egg-shaped crafts came towards them and was floating above the truck. The object was totally silent and then shot off into the sky. Chris drove home at full speed. This strange story did not end there. In the weeks that followed, they all started to experience strange events in their homes, seeing shadowy figures darting around the room and walking through walls, and Chris would hear footsteps running in the attic. After the incident, the other man went silent, and Chris had trouble trying to communicate his experience to his wife. Meanwhile, his son remained traumatised by the whole event. For the next year, Chris kept the whole incident to himself and suffered depression. The strangest thing was that ever since that night, when he had lost 4 hours of his life and had obviously been abducted, he no longer suffered from Crohn's disease, which he'd had for so many years. It had completely gone. Number 2. Dr. Fred Bell. In 1971 in Southern California, Dr. Fred Bell and 2 of his friends were the victims of a bomb explosion. All 3 were injured, where Dr. Bell was thrown off his feet and lost consciousness. He was rushed to Laguna Memorial Hospital. When he awoke, he discovered that his left hand, upper left shoulder and neck were badly burned. He also sustained a minor skull fracture and many painful bruises all over his body. What is unusual about this case is that Bell claims to have been in contact with human-looking aliens since childhood, called Pleiadians, and this had continued throughout his life. Bell claimed that they had always assisted him throughout his life with warnings and advice. At one time, they gave him a necklace called a receptor, which they said would protect him. While he was lying, battered and bruised in hospital, He felt the necklace start to heat up and sent an energy throughout his whole body, and within minutes he was completely healed. It was shortly after this event that he was visited by friends who watched in total amazement as he slowly removed his bandages, revealing no wounds. He was totally healed. The hospital physicians ran tests over his body but could find no answer to his miraculous cure. One of the physicians said, "This is impossible. You have no trace of the severe burns that had damaged your left hand, upper left shoulder and your neck. There is no longer evidence of a skull fracture, and your bruises have gone. How did this happen?" Because of the sudden and miraculous healing, the doctor then accused Bell of faking his injuries. Bell was now in perfect health and was released from hospital. Bell did not dare tell the doctors about the necklace, which had somehow cured him with its unknown energy. Number 1. Howard Menger. Ever since he was a little boy, Menger had a regular contact with aliens who claimed they were from various planets in the solar system, and in some cases came from different vibratory planes. Over the years, Menger claims to have had a lot of contact with aliens. He was even taken aboard a UFO and given a tour of the moon. He was told many predictions which later came true. Menger also claimed to have received a healing from the aliens. In April 1945, Howard Menger was a soldier during World War II and was on the Pacific island of Okinawa in the Pacific Ocean. After American warplanes had bombed the island, the American infantry were unable to take control. It was during this period when Menger was seriously wounded. As he was patrolling the airstrip, a shell from a nearby island landed on the airstrip. Menger then fell to the ground for protection. After the explosion, he thought he had escaped injury, but then felt something stinging in his right eye. He then put his hand to his eye and pulled out a piece of shrapnel. Although he received prompt medical treatment, his eye became badly infected and he lost sight of his right eye. Unfortunately, Menger's eye infection was so severe it quickly spread to his other eye, and Menger was now totally blind in both eyes. It was at this low moment in his life that something happened in the hospital tent, where he was visited by an unidentified lady. Menger asked if she was a nurse, but she didn't reply, and told him that he was the one she had come to see, and was amazed that she seemed to know a good deal about him, and assured him that his sight would be restored. It was at this time that Menger felt that she was one of his extraterrestrial friends and was sent to help him. Gradually, Menger's sight returned, and he miraculously regained his sight. He was also able to see the woman who had come to assist him, and saw an attractive woman dressed in an army nurse's uniform, and although she had helped him greatly, she never made herself known directly. The nurse did however say to Menger that he would later meet someone very important. And a short time later, he had a strong urge to drive to a remote area of the island, where he met a human-looking extraterrestrial who told him that a terrible bomb would shortly be dropped. She was talking about the bombs that would hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The alien told him that we have been spending a lot of time healing and conditioning you and preparing you for your work to come. Howard Menger went on to write books and died in 2009, aged 87.